Thank you very much for that warm welcome and for something completely different. I'm an old-fashioned teacher and I taught for 18 years, many years ago, but when I was teaching, the idea was that the teacher actually was the authority. The teacher knew more than the children. And as Mark Latham quite rightly said, we now live in a time, and it's been happening for years, where teachers are facilitators, teachers are guides by the side, and children are knowledge navigators and digital natives. And even in primary school now, the buzzword is student agency, that the children are the ones who are the masters of the subject. Now, I totally disagree with all of that, so bear with me for about 15-20 minutes while I tell you what the truth is. And hopefully we can begin a dialogue, a conversation, and take that further. But before I do, and I know it might be controversial, I'd like to do a welcome to country. Some of you would be aware of that. If you fly Qantas, whenever you land, you hear it. If you shop at Woolworths or Coles, on your checkout receipt, there's a welcome to country acknowledgement. So before beginning, I'd like to acknowledge the sovereign land of Australia and the institutions and way of life that ensure our freedoms and liberties. One land, one people, one nation. We stand on the shoulders of giants, and as a result of their legacy, Australia is a beacon of opportunity, equality, justice in an increasingly dangerous and hostile world. So thank God for Australia, and thank God you don't live in Danistan, otherwise known as Victoria. But just related to that, it's no longer taught in our schools, and I reviewed the national curriculum in 2014. It's no longer taught in history. But if you look at the curriculum, the first settlement, or the first fleet, is described as an invasion. Children are taught that it led to genocide. But what they don't know is, along with the first fleet, were two very important books. There were many books, but one was the King James Bible and the other was Blackstone's Laws of England. Now, it's only because of that heritage, that history, that we've been so lucky to inherit, that we are what we are, as I said, a relatively peaceful, prosperous country where our liberties and freedoms generally are taken as something for granted. And I know the last 2-3 years, obviously I'm from Melbourne, we've seen those liberties and freedoms curtailed, but the reality is, well, as they say in America, we have to be eternally vigilant. But welcome to country. As I said, one land, one people, one nation. Now, the title of the talk is I'm a Tree. Clearly, I'm not a tree. If I was, I'd want to be a Eucalyptus grandis. Hopefully in Tasmania, where apparently trees are sacred and preserved. It was a satirical piece because, as many of you would understand, this whole idea of identity politics, woke identity politics, has become so out of hand, so extreme, that we live in a world like Alice in Wonderland where we've gone down the rabbit hole. And that's the kind of world our young people have been living in for too long. One example, and I don't want to offend people, men with what are called working penises. And I'm not quite sure what stage that working penis is kind of in. But men with working penises who self-identify as people with vaginas or people who menstruate, i.e. women, are allowed in women's prisons. And that's happening in England and Australia, and it's appalling. It is a shame. The guidelines for kindergartens and even Kids Helpline now tell 4- or 5-year-old children that they can self-identify anywhere on the LGBTIQ+ spectrum. So little tackers, many of them who can't even tie their shoelaces, are now being told by gender activists that they can self-identify. And in Victoria and Tasmania, if you want to change your birth certificate or your driver's licence, you can, so that you're non-binary. So I'm not a tree, but what I am is somebody who many years ago was lucky enough to go to America to a think tank conference in Atlanta, Georgia. And this was about 1995. And I was able to purchase a book there, Politically Correct Dictionary and Guide. And this was 1995. In America, the realisation was that what was called political correctness was really becoming rampant. And since that time, I've written, as many of you would know, for the papers, but also books on the issue. And I started to think some years ago, where did it all come from? And we've had many examples over the last day or two, and we'll have many more to come, about examples of being politically correct, of being woke. People talk about cancel culture. But if you go back far enough to the Communist Manifesto, you can start to get an idea of where it all began. Marx and Engels, as we know, argued that Western civilization, Western societies were riven with structural inequality, where the workers were oppressed by the bourgeoisie, and such was the oppressive nature of capitalism, the manifesto argued, any action, no matter how violent or cruel, is justified. And I'll quote Lenin, who argued, morality is whatever brings about the success of the proletarian revolution. And there is an Italian philosopher, Augusto Del Noce, who, if you've not heard of, you should try and find out more about him. I think he's one of the most prescient and insightful cultural critics, apart from Roger Swarter, God bless him. But Del Noce argues Marxism is underpinned by the conviction that every kind of violence, every illegal action, every deception is allowed if it's deemed necessary to bring about the glorious people's revolution. So a lot of what we now see can be traced back to Marxism. And as we know, as a result of Marxism, millions have been starved, tortured, killed, whether by Lenin or Stalin, whether it's Mao Zedong or Pol Pot, returning to year zero, more millions have suffered violence and starvation. But even worse, and George Orwell talks about this quite a lot, who obviously has written Animal Farm in 1984, but Orwell, when he was involved in the Spanish Civil War, he argued what frightened him most wasn't the violence, the physical violence of being shot or killed. When he started to think about what was happening in Europe, he wrote that what frightened him most was the rise of fascism and communism, dictatorial, totalitarian regimes, much like Big Brother and the Party in 1984, where if they said 4 and 4 is 9, you would have to believe them. And we know what happened to Winston, anyone who questioned that. So much like the woke ideologues of today, free speech is denied, history is rewritten, and in place of rationality and reason, we now have propaganda and what Orwell called doublethink. And he gave the example of peace. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. And under dictator Dan, in what is the Antipodean Venezuela, Victoria, the government spent millions of dollars telling us as we were locked up that staying apart keeps us together. Straight out of George Orwell, 1984, Big Brother. The other factor that we need to look at, as well as the Communist Manifesto, is the Frankfurt School in Germany during the 1920s. Now, I won't go into a lot of detail, but Michael Gove, the English politician, in his book Celsius 77, describes the rise of what he calls cultural Marxism. The idea back in the 1920s and 30s was that the Glorious People's Revolution was never going to occur in the West. The workers were not going to take to the barricades. So what the academics in the Frankfurt School realised, in the place of traditional capitalism, they would attack the reigning values of the West and what some people call the Long March through the institutions, which some people attribute to Antonioni Gramsci, others to Rudy Dubček, I think it was, during the 60s and 70s, the time of student rebellion. This idea of the way to win, the way to destroy capitalism, to overthrow Western culture, was to take the Long March through schools, universities, the media, family, the church, whatever it might be. And we only have to look at the ABC or the Sydney Morning Herald or the Age to see how successful that march has been. More importantly, and this is what concerns me, Del Noce describes this philosophy coming out of the Frankfurt School as a revolutionary one where liberation becomes the criterion for truth. The disappearance of authority must be viewed as the end point. So what these academics argued is that there is no truth, there are no facts, there is no objective reality. Everything is consumed by the struggle for power. And we see that with the rise of what's called critical theory. Wanda Skodonska, who wrote a chapter in one of the books I edited, Cancel Culture and the Left's Long March, which we were selling yesterday. Now they're all sold out, unfortunately. But in that book, Wanda talks about this critical literacy tearing down the cultural superstructure and replacing it by this concept of power and losing freedom and autonomy. There is no objectivity. And Marcuse is one of these academics, and I'll move on quickly here to his essay, Repressive Tolerance. Some of you may have read. But what Marcuse argued is that instead of being an inherent good, tolerance is condemned as a critical part of the ideological state apparatus, to use their jargon, used to enforce the status quo and to marginalise the other. So Marcuse, and I'll just quote him, tolerance strengthens the tyranny of the majority. As a result, the conclusion is reached that the objective of tolerance must call for intolerance. So it's a bit like doublethink. The reason to show tolerance is to be intolerant. And we see so many examples of that, where supposedly intelligent, mature people, academics in our universities and in our school curriculum, talk about being tolerant, generous, giving people agency, as they call it, respecting others, respecting diversity. But at the same time, as I was attacked by a young woman in a conference, people like me or you who disagree and argue a counterpoint are attacked and vilified. So I was attacked for being male, pale and stale. Camille Paglia, some of you might know, I'll just quote her, "We are plunged once again into an ethical chaos where intolerance masquerades as tolerance and where individual liberty is crushed by the tyranny of the group." And that's why, if I was in charge of the curriculum, I'd make Animal Farm in 1984 compulsory reading for all students. The interesting thing is, if you know your history, communism, socialism, they often, like a snake turning, they eat their own. And that is beginning to happen. Germaine Greer, Camille Paglia have been attacked for arguing a man will always be a man. You can't transition. A woman who I do respect, Barry Weiss, some of you would know, who used to write for the New York Post, she resigned because she could no longer work as a journalist, and she was attacked for wrongthink, very Orwellian. And that's the stage we're at, that it's not just the left, cultural left, attacking people like us, but also any who disagree. Supposedly centre-left people are also victims. And the final factor that I've sort of identified here, and it's chapter 1 of the book I mentioned, Cancel Culture and the Left's Long March, written by Gary Marks. The late 60s and 70s was a time of the Cultural Revolution, the hippie movement, moratoriums, the female eunuch, Germaine Greer. It was a time of a revolution. The students at the Sorbonne took to the streets of Paris, faculties of education, history, literature in America, England, Australia were changed into cultural studies where everything was deconstructed and analysed in terms of postmodernism, deconstructionism, post-colonial gender, sexuality theories. So what you have to understand for the last 30, 40 years, the cultural left has taken over the universities and the schools, and many young teachers have been conditioned to accept what the cultural left argues. Western civilisation, and we saw that with the Ramsay Centre being denied by universities around Australia. Sydney University, a number of academics argue the curriculum must be purged of whiteness, because, and you won't believe me, I mean, if you fly or drive over a bridge, you like to believe that the Greeks had something to do with it, whether it was Pythagoras or that science and physics is something solid associated with Western culture. But in the national curriculum, we now have Indigenous algebra, which I'm not quite sure how that works. And in England, one or two of the universities want to decolonise by getting rid of Enlightenment science. So because the scientists during the Enlightenment were dead, well, as we know, male, pale and stale generally, or dead white males, they were involved in all the imperialist sort of colonial exploitations. So even something like mathematics and science is now being questioned. The other thing that I find very distressing is that in Australia, it's like original sin. We're all guilty of what happened over 200 years ago. So even my wife, Julia, who came from England in 1952, and our children, who are relatively new arrivals, we're all guilty of what happened, this genocide apparently caused by the invasion. And something that I know Warren Mundine talks about, a lot of Indigenous people now argue there's intergenerational trauma. So currently, Indigenous people can excuse the fact that they don't send their children to school, that the men might oppress their women and be violent. They excuse that by saying it's the white man. It's what happened with European settlement. So that is an issue. We no longer have free and open debate. And as somebody was actually saying yesterday, and I think we had that with the previous speaker, I think it was Voltaire said, "I think, therefore I am." We now have, "I feel, therefore I'm right." And that's the danger. And if you criticise or question, you're Eurocentric, racist, sexist, homophobic, you're politically suspect. And the good news is, seeing all of you people here, the tide is starting to turn. And I'll just finish by saying in Melbourne, I organised a conference last week where 35 people came from around Australia, Brisbane, Sydney, Hobart, Perth, to talk about parents and teachers starting their own schools, getting out of the government system, getting out of the non-government system, because many independent schools are even more woke than the government schools. But these teachers, parents, business people, there's a school starting in Sydney next year based on a classical education within the Christian tradition, and that is vital. There's one being planned in Brisbane. So I think, like America, where in Florida, I think it was, in Virginia, the Republican governors there are riding on this community reaction against being woke, where parents are taking their kids out of schools, either homeschooling or starting their own schools. And so, as we say, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. Thank you.